Hello, and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Emily Ellerby. Thank you for joining us in this new format where we continue to bring you the authors you love and their new books to the Politics and Prose community. At any time during the event, you can click on the green button below to purchase tonight's book on PNP's website. Our physical stores are closed, and we need your online purchases in order to keep bringing you the programming that PNP is known for. Tonight, you can ask the author a question by clicking on the Ask a Question button on your screen. It's down near the bottom. You can also read other people's questions, and you can even vote on the ones that you want to hear our author answer the most. And finally, we want to thank you for being here with us tonight. We're so thankful to our family of loyal customers, keeping our business and our spirits afloat. Sarah Menkedick's first essay collection, Homing Instincts, was longlisted for the Penn Diamonstein Spielvogel Award for the Art of the Essay. Her new book is Ordinary Insanity: Fear and the Silent Crisis of Motherhood in America. It explores the scientific, psychological, historical, and spiritual roots of a silent epidemic of anxiety among American mothers. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Sarah Menkedick to PNP Live.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone. Thank you for spending your Saturday afternoon here, hanging out, talking about motherhood at a very apropos time. And thank you so much to Politics and Prose for having me. It's so important to support your indie bookstores right now. So, of course, I would love for you to purchase Ordinary Insanity, and definitely make sure it's from Politics and Prose and from your indies, because they really need our support, and we're not able to go in there and browse and do all the lovely things that we would usually do in a bookstore. So thank you so much to them for doing everything that they do for authors, and for Politics and Prose in particular for putting together these fantastic events. And yeah, without further ado, I'm going to give a little talk about my experience writing the book, and give you a little glimpse. Here it is in all its glory. And here's my heavily sticky noted one that I'm giving my talk from here. So to start out here with just a little bit of background, so the first line of the book is actually, "It began with mouse poop." And so, where that comes from is literally, if I can trace back this whole sort of journey of anxiety that I have followed, it did literally begin one day with me looking at a mouse turd in this small cabin that I was living in rural Ohio, and saying, I wonder if that's dangerous, right? That's how it begins. And then I, of course, Googled it. And then, there was some infinitesimal chance that the mouse could have a virus that was in the poop that somehow I could get, and I wouldn't know it. And then it could make my baby very sick. And that was the first time I felt the sensation of, oh my gosh, everything is dangerous, and I have to sort of constantly be on alert. And I think I thought what a lot of mothers think at that time, which is, well, now I'm being super vigilant. I'm going to clean all that mouse poop. I'm going to scour every surface in my house obsessively until it's gone. And then, I dealt with that, and it's fine. But then something else comes creeping in. It's the plastic water bottle, and what chemicals are in the plastic water bottle, or someone's burning wood outside, and is it bad for me to be inhaling something burning wood and whatnot? So it starts just building and building and building and building. So that was how my anxiety started. And basically it just grew and grew and grew until it became normal, until it just became the way that I mothered. And I just assumed, that's me being a good mother. That's me being hypervigilant and educated and doing all of this research. And it took years for me to really be able to say, no, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this. And it actually took me speaking with another woman, April, who's the first story in the book, to be able to really recognize this as an illness, and to say, wow, this isn't just good mothering. These are symptoms of something that's actually really wrong. And so there are little snippets of my story throughout the book, but really the book is the stories of other women who have gone through, very intense anxiety in all sorts of different forms, and their sort of trajectories, and then woven together with that research about where this epidemic of anxiety comes from. So as I was on my own journey, as I started talking to women, I realized that this was everywhere. And this was sort of a watershed moment for me. So I'd be talking to like my super hippie friend in Massachusetts, who I thought was very together and very on top of everything and not worried at all. And I'd sort of come out with my anxiety and she'd say, well, I'm worried all the time too. And then all of a sudden we would just open the door to that and talk about it. And I started to realize that this was both ubiquitous and really taboo. And so that's where the book came from, is why is this so widespread? Why are we not talking about it? And it seems like we're able to talk frankly about so many other things, but still not about this. And one thing that I really wanted to address when I was writing the book, and particularly when I was looking back on the writing of the book, when I was writing the introduction, was how women's stories are still marginal in our culture. They're still sort of other or special. And I just saw on Twitter the other day a writer tweet something that someone had said verbatim to me years ago, which is, a male writer had said to her, oh, well, my wife will love your book. Right. So I think that just speaks volumes about the way that we tend to think about women's stories, is like, oh, this is something over here for women. And oftentimes, books about motherhood in particular will be shelved in the children's section. Right. So I wanted to tackle that really head on with this book. And I wanted to say, yeah, this is a book about women, and it's a serious book and an important book, and everyone should read it. And women have been reading about men for centuries and centuries. So men can sit down and read about women, in particular about mothers. So I'm just going to read a little excerpt here from the intro, in which I sort of lean really hard into that, because I think this is really a big part of the ethos of the book. And of the writing that I've done in the past couple of years in general. So here in the intro, I say, this is a book about women, their lives, love, brains, history, struggle, triumph, pain, and healing. And yes, men can and damn well should read it too. This is a book about building connections between women. It's about taking back motherhood by recognizing many of the historical, cultural, social, biological, and psychological machinations behind it, and the way in which its salient contemporary emotion is no longer love, but fear. So that's just to give a sense of where I was coming from with the writing of the book, and what sort of drove the book overall, not only the research, but the connections between women that I established when I was writing it, and the women's stories. So, starting out here, the first thing that I really looked at was the neurobiology of the maternal brain, which is fascinating and which I knew nothing about, like so many other things in the book. And I was talking to April, again, the woman who's the first story in the book, and she said to me at one point, I really feel like my brain has been rewired, like this experience has changed my brain. And I said, yeah, I feel like that too. Like I have a different brain with these different pathways grooved into it. And so I started looking into that, reading all these studies in neuroscience, Skyping with neuroscientists, and yes, it's true. You have a different brain after you become a mother, which is incredibly striking and shocking, considering that so many women can tell you what's happening every day of their pregnancies, and the day that the baby has eyelashes, and the day that the baby can sense light, right? But I don't know anyone who could say, actually, this is what's happening to my brain at that same time. And my brain is being rewired, and this section of my brain is growing, and the hormones are doing this to this other section of my brain. So just to walk you through some of those changes, which I think are really important and interesting to highlight. The biggest one is that your brain during pregnancy and the postpartum period literally grows. So whole sections of your brain grow. And one thing that I talk about in the book is that it hurts to grow, right? It's a process to grow and develop. And yet we tend to think of motherhood as something that just happens and voila, you're a mother, and then you go on and all the attention is sort of on the baby and the baby's milestones. But women are literally growing a new brain. So to give some examples again of how that's happening, your brain is flooded with hormones, right? And I think that we talk about hormones in this way of like, oh, they come and they make you crazy for a little while and then they go away and you're sort of back to your normal self. But what the hormones are actually doing is remaking your brain. So the hormones are sort of revving up the neurons in your brain, and particularly in one section of the brain called the MPOA that's tied to maternal behavior. Basically what the hormones are doing is that they're increasing the length and the number of the signal receiving branches on those neurons. So the neurons have these little branches on the end of them, and sort of the more branches that they have and the longer they are, the more sensitive they are. So your brain is, a woman's brain during pregnancy is becoming sort of hypersensitized. And one more example of that is that there are these astrocytes, which are star-shaped cells, right? Which I sort of compare to like volunteers during a marathon, like handing out Gatorade, right? Because they're meant to support other neurons during times of growth and stimulation for the brain. So all of this, one researcher that I talked to compared it to thoroughbreds, like at the starting line of a race. Like your brain is just revved up to go, right? It's set for this task of significant magnitude, which is taking care of an infant, right? So all of this is happening during this time, and like many researchers I talked to said, there's just ample opportunity here for certain things to be reinforced, especially certain behaviors, checking behaviors, things like that. And one researcher that I spoke with at Yale, James Leckman, found in his research, so his wife had developed this whole set of obsessive behaviors after she gave birth. And he, being a scientist, conducted a number of studies and found that 95% of fathers and 95% of mothers, and 80% of fathers were experiencing sort of obsessive, excessive worry and behaviors after the birth of their infants. And so what he found in his study was that mothers spent an average of 14 hours a day worrying about their infants. And more than 80% worried about their baby's development, illness, and harm. And many, quote, reported the persistence of graphic images in which they failed as parents. So this was the norm, right? I think this is something many women experience, the thought of, I'm going to drop my baby and their skull is going to be shattered on the floor, or the car is going to crash and this is going to happen to my baby. These sort of vivid, intrusive thoughts. I mean, this is something that remains very much taboo, but that I think research has shown is actually quite common in this postpartum period. So I think that, and Leckman has hypothesized that, of course, evolutionarily, this makes sense, right? Because throughout history, many babies have not survived. And so a sort of hypervigilance, it makes sense that that might be the norm. So my question became, why now is this behavior not just the norm during that brief window of the newborn stage or during this sort of transition, but why has it become the norm overall in our experience of motherhood? Why is this now something that's is sort of like almost a pathological worry has become the standard, right? And so looking at clinical studies on postpartum anxiety, they've found postpartum anxiety rates of about 17%. And that's compared to postpartum depression rates of about 8%. So something that's actually quite common. And those studies are really measuring sort of the most extreme edge, the clinical edge of postpartum anxiety. So women whose anxiety is so debilitating to the point where they would need medicine or intervention or whatnot. And so some of the researchers that I spoke to have said that's not measuring what we would call subclinical anxiety. So women who might be experiencing it at quite a debilitating level, but not quite enough to be given a clinical diagnosis. So to say that this has become very common, in fact, among mothers. And so the question, so I'm sort of lay that out in the beginning of the book, and why we sort of focus so much on depression and don't really talk at all about anxiety. And I think one of the answers to that is, and in the book, sort of the whole rest of the book is looking at that from all of these different angles, like why have we gotten to this space? And one of the most interesting things that I discovered is because we don't really flag anxiety as problematic, because in a way we're constantly sort of sanctioning it. And because the way that we think about risk in particular in pregnancy and the postpartum period is actually somewhat pathological and strange. And it's unlike the way that we think about risk in most other domains of medicine and certainly in our everyday lives. So this was one of the most fascinating areas of research that I did for the book, because it's one of those things that I think many women who become mothers understand instinctually. Like there's something strange about the way that risks are being presented to me. Like one of the women in the book said, I was too scared to change a light bulb, right? This is a woman who's highly self-sufficient, has built up her entire career, and was just sort of terrified of everything. Like, what if I eat the turkey? What if I eat the hummus? Well, like, will that kill my baby? Or me with the mouse poop? I consider myself like traveled all around the world alone, and yet I'm completely undone by mouse poop, right? So I think a lot of women instinctually understand that there's something strange about this culture of pregnancy. And when I started researching this, it made so much sense to me that yes, basically in this period, we sort of have this obsession with zero risk. It's just not possible. There's no way to achieve zero risk in any domain of our lives. But there's this sort of fantasy of being able to do that during pregnancy that I think instills in women this really destructive way of thinking about their responsibility as mothers. So to give you one example of that, I read this fascinating study in the Journal of Bioethics on home birth. And at the start of that study, it was written by a couple of bioethicists. They had cited a piece from The Lancet, which is one of the premier medical journals. And the doctors in The Lancet had written, women have the right to choose how and where to give birth, but they do not have the right to put their baby at risk. Which is really kind of an extraordinary statement. And so this article went on to say that basically the risk of dying, the risk of a baby dying in a home birth in the US is about 1 in 1,000, right? That's about the same risk as a baby dying in a rural hospital, right? But you would never imagine a doctor saying to a woman, if you give birth in a rural hospital, your baby could die. It's incredibly irresponsible. It's incredibly reckless. You shouldn't do it. There's no excuse for that. You have to go to the top medical center and New York City or wherever it may be. But that is the way that home birth is routinely presented to many women as something that's reckless and that's dangerous because it involves a slightly higher risk than hospital birth. But meanwhile, numerous studies have shown that, all sorts of other risks involved in birth, including hemorrhaging and infections and assisted ventilation, C-sections, go way down with home birth, and women can have much better outcomes. This is obviously in a low risk, pregnancy situation, right? It's changes with high risk pregnancies. But most women are not sort of presented with the risks in this way. What they're presented with is sort of the most extreme model of risk that if you do this, your baby could die, right? And it's not in keeping with evidence-based medicine in many other domains, and it sort of instills this notion that any risk at all is unacceptable. No matter your own values as a woman, no matter your own culture and your priorities, it's just completely unacceptable. So to give another example, a friend of mine wanted her daughter to be present at her birth in the hospital here in Pittsburgh. She had already had 2 children. This would be her 3rd child, natural births. Totally healthy babies. And the OB said to her, when she said that, you could die during your birth. You could have a cardiac arrest. You could bleed out on the table. Do you want your daughter to see that? And she was utterly taken aback in the moment. And my friend, being very strong-willed woman, ended up writing a letter to the OB in the hospital, saying, this is crazy that I'm being sort of scared out of this for these extremely minor risks, when for me it's really important to have my family there to witness this moment. I mean, there was no response to that, but I think that's a good example of the way in which women are sort of taught to not accept any risk at all, even when the risk is infinitesimal, right? And so the authors of this study went on to say basically that if women do not have the right to put their babies at risk, then women shouldn't be able to, say, drive or go outside in thunderstorms or ride a bike, right? That once you start following this logic down this path, then all women should be able to do all day is sit at home and research all the potential risks to their unborn child. And that is, in fact, what many women do. But no one is measuring the risks of that. And one of the things that my book is doing, I think that Ordinary Insanity is doing, is saying this is a risk as well. And we're all living that out, living that risk right now in the way that we're living our lives, or the way that we're limiting our lives, the way that I limited my lives. So to give one more example of that, that was really powerful for me was on co-sleeping. So I remember when my daughter was a teeny tiny little newborn, and we went into the pediatrician's office, and they had a poster on the door of a butcher knife and a baby in bed together, right? Very, very big, very colorful poster. And the notion was that, sleeping with your baby obviously is extremely dangerous, right? And I, at that point, had been co-sleeping with my daughter. I was breastfeeding. We had a very hard, futon bed. I kicked my husband out. I, put bumpers on the sides. There were no pillows, no stuffed animals, nothing. And it was working for us. And so, me being the sort of dutiful, wanting to please authority, I was like, I'm co-sleeping. Is that okay? And the pediatrician said, absolutely not, extremely dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. And I went home and, me being me, a little over the top, I did all my research. And what I found was that in that year in Ohio, this was 2015, there were 471 infants who died in sleeping areas that weren't their infant beds, right? Over half of those infants were born prematurely, and over a quarter were born before 24 weeks, which is very, very early, right? So that means 240 infants that year died in unsafe, full-term infants died in unsafe sleep situations. Of those, it's not clear how many their parents may have been doing drugs, may have been using alcohol, may have taken the baby onto the couch in a moment of desperation or whatnot. Those circumstances aren't clear, right? So that's 0.1% of all infants born in 2015 who died this way, right? And I said to myself, this is crazy. This is, this has made an enormous difference in my life. I've done my research. I'm breastfeeding. I'm sleeping on this stripped down bed, and I'm going to do this. And it was the one time that I really stood up to sort of the standard advice, and it made an enormous difference in my life that first year postpartum. And then in 2018, when my daughter was 3, NPR published a study called "Is Sleeping with Your Baby as Dangerous as Experts Say?" And basically what it concluded was no, what I'd researched in 2015, which is that a lot of these studies conflate different circumstances, whether it's a full-term infant sleeping with a breastfeeding mother or a premature infant being put to sleep in a car seat or whatnot, and that the actual risk of SIDS in co-sleeping is 1 in 16,400. So in comparison, the risk of being struck by lightning is 1 in 13,000. But mothers are being asked to sort of dramatically remake their lives and their relationships with their babies for this risk that is, slimmer than the risk of being struck by lightning. And there are so many different examples of this, and I do draw on a number of different examples that sort of lead to this almost pathological way of thinking about risk that I think instills a very distorted sense of a mother's responsibility during this time. Yes. All right. So there's so much in here that I would love to talk about, but I've tried to distill it down to a few areas. And the next area that I want to cover that I think is really important is experts, right? So I go through a lot of different history in the book. And what I discovered as I was reading this history is that there has always been a sort of emphasis on women conforming to a certain notion of femininity, right? Whatever that was at different times throughout history. And as women sort of push for more autonomy and more freedom, there tends to be a sort of pushback of a stronger emphasis on traditional feminine roles. So, we see that happening like with the 1980s onward as women are really going out to the workforce in huge numbers in the US. Suddenly there's this explosion of intensive parenting and, the role that a parent must play is just expands in all these different ways. I mean, I think we've seen that throughout history. So one thing I, discovered was that, from everything from burning witches at the stake, right? And a lot of those witches were female lay healers or midwives who were sort of stepping out into a territory they weren't supposed to be in at that point as medicine was becoming this male-dominated domain. And then, in the Victorian times, there was this sense that a woman could not have a uterine uterus and a brain at the same time, or, you know, a brain and a uterus competing for attention. So if a woman was using her brain too much, like reading romantic novels, heaven forbid, then her uterus was just going to atrophy and it wasn't going to be able to function. So there was this fad for a while during that time of literally injecting things into a woman's uterus to try and get the woman to like come to her senses, to let the uterus take over the brain. So, you know, these sound absurd to us now, but I think what we're seeing now is a similar thing happening with motherhood, right? There's this extremely rigid, extremely narrow definition of what it means to be a good mother. And there's so much that's not allowed there and that's taboo there. And so there's this very narrow category of femininity, and women who stray from that will be sort of ostracized or criticized or literally punished in all sorts of ways. And so the story of the woman in this section of the book was a woman who was actually institutionalized against her will, which is a shocking story for me and to discover. And she, you know, and I think her story is really an illustration of what we are simply unwilling to accept from mothers. And I think a lot of that is really tied to experts. So the 20th century was dubbed the century of the child, right? Where the child is now this sort of sacred, innocent creature who has to be nurtured and protected and made into this like ideal citizen. And this is true. It's important to say mostly for white children, right? For children of color, for immigrant children, a very different history there. And I also have huge sections of the book devoted to the experiences of women of color, which are also really important to note here. So this section also talks about how, you know, for women of color and for children of color, this was a very different experience. But for white mothers, there was this sense that the child was this precious creature who had to be sort of built into this perfect citizen. And of course, that responsibility couldn't be left just to mothers. So experts had to step in and guide the mothers. And so there's this great quote that I found in this book by the historian Anne Holbert, that at the turn of the 20th century, mothers were expected to walk and speak ever so softly and carry a big chart. So mothers were supposed to be sort of internalizing all this expert advice and like being little lab assistants, and then building these perfect citizens out of that, right? And we're still very much living that out now, although in the mid 20th century, that started to shift into what we would call permissive parenting now. So more like we need to develop the child's self-esteem and the child's ego, and you need to make sure that you're you know, paying attention to all of your child's individual needs and desires, right? And that very much dovetails with the explosion of consumer culture. Like, what are your child's choices? What are your child's tastes? And how can you nurture that? So it was the same emphasis on your child needs exactly this amount of sleep, exactly this amount of protein. And if you stray from that, you could be really putting your child at risk. But now with this whole other set of you know, emotional needs and sort of nurturing the individual as the ultimate, you know, we love the individual in the US, and so the individual is the ultimate ideal. So how can you make this perfect individual child? And then now, you know, with intensive parenting, we're seeing that even more so. So motherhood is supposed to be sort of this highly scientific thing where we're all supposed to be doing our research on the perfect bicycle helmet and the perfect baby food and the perfect sling. And yet at the same time, it's supposed to be natural and intuitive, and you're supposed to do just what your particular child needs and respond to their particular needs and sort of craft an individual motherhood out of that. And so the sociologist Sharon Hayes, she defined intensive parenting now as expert-guided, child-centered, emotionally absorbing, labor-intensive, and financially expensive. So, yeah, when I read that, I was like, yes, yeah, that. It's very intense, right? It's and it's sort of a lot of conflicting things coming together, where your child has to sleep this amount and eat this amount and, you know, achieve this milestone at this time. And yet at the same time, you should trust your instinct and just do what the indigenous cultures in Brazil have done for all of time, right? So mothers are sort of steeped in this rhetoric, and there's this sense that mothering is this role that you have to play, and that role is almost the role of a therapist, right? You should sort of clean your own emotions, your own, especially sort of taboo emotions, and you play this role. And if you can't play that role, then you might be institutionalized, or you might be ostracized, or you might have, as the writer Kim Brooks did, she wrote a book about this experience where she left her child in the car for several minutes and had the police called and had to deal with a whole set of reports and whatnot. So we have this very rigid sense of the role of mothers, and straying from that brings real consequences, and that's a long historical trend. So it's not just something recent, but its most recent incarnation, I think, is intensive parenting. And finally, the last thing that I think it's really important to talk about, and particularly important maybe for Mother's Day, is something that we almost never talk about in the context of motherhood, which is loss and grief. And so the final story in the book is this woman who had a very traumatic experience with her first pregnancy. She had a loss. She had to make the decision to terminate the pregnancy, and she had struggled for years to get pregnant. So this was an incredibly difficult decision for anyone, very difficult decision for her and her partner. And I remember she described it to me as, after she made that decision, she had to terminate the pregnancy. This was about halfway through, almost 20 weeks. She said, "I just went into the silo." And I thought that was such a profound and moving way of describing it, of this silo where we just have no way, no sort of cultural expression or ritual for expressing this kind of grief and loss in the context of motherhood. And that is, I think, really devastating and isolating for women. And that sort of set her up for this whole experience, very intense experience of anxiety and isolation in her second pregnancy. So in this chapter, I look at the experience of the Buddhist nun, Joan Halifax, whose work I love. And she was an anthropologist for many years. And so she talks about observing these rituals in Mali and thinking about how in the US, we really don't have any rituals to mark this change in a woman's life. So the only ritual that she could think of was perhaps men going to war. There are rituals around that, and rituals for men returning from war. But there's really no ritual around the experience of becoming a mother, which for many women is an absolutely sort of self-shattering, life-shattering experience in many ways, a beautiful experience, but also an extremely difficult one. And so Joan Halifax, this quote from Joan Halifax where she says, "What were the consequences, I continually asked myself, of living in a culture where change is not marked?" And I think one of those consequences is that we end up in this sort of frantic scramble for control and this frantic anxiety, instead of being able to really lean into the loss and the grief that can be a central part of becoming a mother. And so I found this fascinating work by a British psychologist, Paula Nicholson, who studied women's transition to motherhood, and who says that there is this really strong taboo during this context of new motherhood in particular, against mourning and against grief. And she writes, "So strong is the taboo that women themselves frequently fail to admit their sense of loss in a conscious way." And I think this is true for experience like Sonia's, like the woman in the book who have a very real loss and tragic loss, but also for women who experience maybe a more diffuse or ambiguous sense of grief and loss. And I know that when I became a mother, it was the first time that I had this real sort of like lightning strike sense of, oh my gosh, I could lose everything and it would be horrible. And I don't know how I would survive it, right? I mean, I had been married for almost 10 years. I was 31. And that was the first time in my life that I had the sensation of of experiencing real grief. And my daughter was healthy and happy, but this sense that if something happened to her, or when something happens to me, when I die, I had this very palpable sense of that and of what that meant. And I think that's the first time many women will experience that. And yet there's no space for that, really. There's no ritual for that. And so Nicholson lists a whole series of losses that are inherent to having a child: loss of autonomy, identity, work, time, friends, relationship patterns, sexuality, health, comfort. right? So, and you know, I think women experience one or many of these, but that's not one of the ways that we talk about motherhood. So one of the arguments that I make in the book is that postpartum depression, as we tend to call it, or anxiety, is sort of the only outlet that we have for making sense of this grief, right? Of expressing this grief. And we sort of tend to treat it as like, this is a pathology. It's very weird. You treat it and then it's done, because we have no real cultural outlet for expressing this darker side of motherhood. All right, so to close out here on a happy note, on an upbeat note, I wanted to talk about power, because while this book is very much about looking at, you know, how we've sort of ended up where we're at with motherhood in terms of being in the middle of this epidemic of anxiety and what has fed that and what has created that, it's also about making motherhood visible, and in that finding a way to sort of, I say, take it back or to empower it, and finding a way for women to find power as mothers. So I want to end with this very brief reading from this section where I bury my daughter's placenta. And I talk here about how before this, I don't really come from a placenta burying kind of people. This is not something that I would have thought I would be doing. But that's very much the point of this section, that becoming a mother required a sort of bravery and vulnerability that I never would have imagined. And then I think there's real opportunity and chance for empowerment there. So I'm just going to read the little ending of this section of burying the placenta. So this is after we've put the placenta in the ground. Also, I kept it after my birth, and it was in my parents' freezer. And basically what happened is my dad was rummaging through the freezer, like the extra meat freezer that they have one day. And he was like, what's this? And then it was like, oh God, it's Sarah's placenta. So there was this moment of like, you have to bury your child's placenta within the next couple of months. So that forced the issue. So here we are burying the placenta. Elena, that's my daughter, Elena. Elena and I placed flowers and handfuls of earth atop her placenta. I felt a wrenching mourning for the end of her babyhood, not because I missed her milky smell or swirling a finger around the tenderness of her soft spot or her marshmallow baby fat, but because that period demanded more of me than any other time of my life. Because it was when I had to be the bravest and most vulnerable person I have ever been. I dropped fistfuls of Ohio dirt on top of the placenta, and one thought looped through my head. This birthing and early mothering was the hardest thing I have ever done. This was the hardest thing I have ever done. That Sunday night of Elena's 3rd birthday, I wept beside her in bed. For her, but more, I believe, for myself. For a resilience I never knew I had, and that I believe all mothers possess, however they choose to express it. We are not soft, sweet, docile icons, mute and passive virgins. We are fucking fierce. Motherhood requires a tremendous bravery that I never recognized or celebrated before I was forced to come into it, shaking and stunned. It leads women to march, to protest, to fight, to enact change, to persevere at great risk to themselves, to challenge the very foundation of society. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. That is Ordinary Insanity, purchase it from Politics and Prose. And thank you so much for coming and hanging out today.
Sarah, wow, thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk. I enjoyed it so much. And as you might imagine, the audience has questions for you.
Yeah.
And if anyone out there still has a question that you haven't asked yet, you can go ahead and do that while we're talking by clicking the ask a question button at the bottom of your screen. And you can also vote on the questions. And the one that has the most votes at the moment is from Grace, asks, I believe this risk aversion phenomenon you touch on is systemic in our healthcare system in the US and has a lot of roots and causes beyond mothering and pregnancy. Do you think this is specific to the US among Western cultures?
Wow, that's a great question. And I don't know if I'm super qualified to be an expert on this, but I definitely think that, yeah, we have a very sort of extreme model of risk aversion here. It's interesting because my husband is from Mexico, and so he finds so much of US culture to be about sort of constantly planning for and preparing for the absolute worst case scenario, and sort of living your life in this constant like crouched position waiting for something terrible to happen. And he finds that very baffling, but then Mexicans, to make a huge generalization, he tends to be very fatalistic about like, if it's going to happen to me, it's going to happen to me, right? So I do think that's the case for many aspects of our culture in general, and certainly for the medical system, right, which also tends to sort of isolate things and think about them very much, in these sort of little boxes, as opposed to thinking much more holistically about the whole experience of the person. So yeah, I think that's a really astute observation, that's probably true of many aspects of our culture and our medical system.
Yeah. Here's another. Do you think social media is feeding anxiety and societal pressures for mothers?
Yeah, I mean, so social media, in terms of like whether women are seeing this very idealized sense of motherhood, absolutely. I mean, I was just talking to someone about this the other day, which, she was saying, oh, it seems like everybody else in quarantine is like doing family dance videos and like baking adorable things. And I'm just like constantly on conference calls and stressed out. And I was like, no, so there's like the 15-minute window everybody has of like, during the day. And then, that's it. So I think that's definitely a factor, but I really think what's more problematic is like the Googling. I mean, for almost everyone of the women that I interviewed for the book, they would spend hours and hours online just trying to get this certainty about everything of like, is it okay to do this? Or is it dangerous to do this? And there's just such an overwhelming amount of information, both medical information and then anecdotal information, that women are just kind of drowning in this. And I know that was a huge issue for me, is that it's easy to just go down this rabbit hole and try and find this like sense of control of like, how can I do everything just so? And there's no real answer to that, but it's easy to waste, hours and hours and hours of time trying to figure it out online. And I think this is new for recent generations of women, whereas, before it's like you might be able to get out all the parenting books or you'd get advice from other women, but just the sheer quantity of information, if you're trying to get information or you're trying to figure something out that you can sort of bury yourself in, is overwhelming. And I think it's like one of the women in the book said, she's a Black woman who had 4 pregnancies. And so her story is the story of her first pregnancy, which was ended really dramatically in the hospital. And then she ended up having unassisted home births for her later pregnancies. And one of the things that she really vowed to do for her later pregnancies was just not to Google anything. So I think that's a huge issue, and probably in my case, in my experience, researching bigger even than social media.
Great. Okay, so this is more of a comment for you to comment on than a question, it looks like, but it did get some positive votes, so I'll read it for you. We need to talk about the economic cost of being a mom. You get passed over in the workplace, etc. You're not considered sexy or smart or competent. It changes your relationship with your partner. So the anxiety and loss of that is real and undocumented.
Yeah, definitely. And so one section of the book, like I said, there's so much more here. So I hope you will buy it and read it. But one of the sections that I didn't touch on is about the history of what historians have sort of called maternalism and momism. So these sort of 2 strains, and this is a gross oversimplification, but basically that there was this era in American history, especially at the start of the 20th century, with these progressive reformers who were mothers, and they sought power on the basis of their identity as mothers. So we're talking about people here like Jane Addams or like the suffragettes saying, well, we need to give women the right to vote because they're mothers, right? Or we need to empower women because they are mothers and because they should be making these choices as mothers. And then what happened was that there was a major backlash to that at mid-century. And this basically comes from one man, white man, who wrote a book basically decrying what he called momism, that moms have way too much power in our culture. And why do moms have all this power when it's not that hard to give birth and it's not that big of a deal to be a mom, and it's just sort of a private thing that you should do over here in your own home, and why are we like, like sort of adoring mothers when really this is just like a trivial, petty little thing that's not that big of a deal. And that has really been the way that we have gone as a culture, with this notion that motherhood is this sort of private identity. It doesn't have any space in political spheres, in the work sphere. This is also true in art, right? I mean, just now we're starting to see some pushback in the spheres of art and literature where motherhood can be a serious literary topic. But for a long time, sort of your motherhood should be over here, and your serious intellectual life or public life should be over here. And I think that's had a really devastating impact for mothers. This is also an outgrowth, and another thing that I talk about in the book, sadly, of second wave feminism, where we're sort of seeking the power of white men under capitalism, and so it's like we're going to totally minimize the domestic sphere, and women who have to work there, or women who have to stay at home as mothers, well, oh, that's unfortunate, and that there's no power there, and what the impact of that, of sort of like modeling our sense of power and our sense of the ideal on this sort of like white male capitalist standard, is that we don't have any paid leave policies, right? We don't have any sort of functional integration of those two spheres. So that's a really important history, I think, to talk about, and the way in which sort of there's this expectation that motherhood is not a serious thing. Motherhood is not, and also that because motherhood is a choice, we shouldn't have to, we as a society shouldn't be in charge of sort of taking care of mothers or children. And I think we can see that playing out in really dramatic ways now, where you do get some of this rhetoric of like, why are you whining so much about being stuck at home with your kids? You chose to have kids, right? We have this notion that we're not responsible as a society for taking care of mothers and children, that you made this selfish choice and now you figure it out on your own. Obviously, that has very real consequences for mothers and children. So.
Yeah, that's great. I think there's several, you just addressed several questions. That was so wonderful. Could you talk more about the consequences of intensive motherhood on mothers of color? There's a high standard for what we expect mothers to be able to accomplish, but what about those who are already dealing with systemic inequalities, which limit their abilities to reduce risk or conform?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think this has huge consequences on mothers of color, right? On this expectation that that mothers, this extremely narrow and rigid definition of what is good mothering. And I think one of the things that I, discovered in the book is I spoke with another, so there were two Black women whose stories are in the book, and sort of surrounding their stories is all this research about all sorts of different things, from the history of Black midwifery, which I knew nothing about, was shocked to know nothing about, to sort of the statistics surrounding outcomes for women of color, for Black women in particular during pregnancy. But one of the women was a single mother, and she ended up becoming a doula after having a rather traumatic experience of pregnancy and postpartum. And she had this sort of constant oppressive sense that she had failed because she wasn't part of this like standard nuclear family, right? And when I started researching that, there is this like persistent notion throughout much of American history, and particularly from sort of the 1950s onward, that children are better off as part of this standard white nuclear family, and that the cause of, in particular, of like problems with Black children is because, it's Black women, right? And this is a really destructive stereotype and sort of myth that has been very persistent for many years, and that has this very real impact on Black women. I mean, she had sort of struggled under that for a long time, in spite of the fact that, many studies have shown that, like for white women, for example, when they get divorced or they become single mothers, that can be a significant cause of poverty. But for Black children, right, being part of a nuclear family doesn't actually improve their outcomes, right? That shockingly, systemic racism tends to be the culprit here, and not this like single motherhood. But there's this enormous stigma on single mothers and on not being part of a nuclear, Black single mothers in particular, and on not being part of a nuclear family. And that has very real impacts and on those mothers, and also the sort of stereotypes that they're constantly confronting going out into the world. And one writer in the book who I quote put it as, that white women are laboring under this myth of being the perfect mother, being the ideal mother, having to do that perfectly. But Black women are constantly sort of fighting back against this myth of not being the right kind of mother all the time. And that's a whole other different kind of pressure. So.
All right, Michelle wants to know, do you have any suggestions in turning the wave of this risk aversion to stem the anxiety? You mentioned the mixed messages of over-researching and follow your intuition. What do you think needs to happen to make some significant changes?
That's interesting. I mean, I wonder, like on a systemic level or on a personal level. I mean, I would say I had a really interesting conversation with a midwife who is a teaching midwife at a big university hospital, who read the book and said, I would love to institute these changes in the way that we talk to our patients about risk, which I thought was really fascinating in terms of just, instead of framing it like I talked about in the talk, in terms of like, well, you need to understand the gravity of what you're doing here, and you could have this horrible outcome from your baby, like, just talking about risk in very different ways in this context. So I think on a systemic level, that's one way to go. And also, there's this sort of infantilizing of women that happens. So this is true. This is, very polarizing issue, but alcohol and pregnancy, right? Instead of sort of presenting the studies on alcohol use in pregnancy, there often is this very extreme, well, if you have a drink, you could be, something horrible could happen to your baby. That's an example of the kind of rhetoric that women are constantly exposed to. So instead of that, sort of having a rhetoric that's much more, look, here's what the studies show in this case, or with Holmberg, here's what the studies show in this case, and empowering women to be able to make their own decisions. And then I think for women personally, I think we have this culture. So, one of the refrains that I go over in the book is that we're constantly saying, why risk it, right? I mean, how many women who have been pregnant or in early motherhood have heard that refrain just over and over? Oh, well, maybe you want some brie, and turkey, but why risk it? Just why risk it? And once you start following that logic to a certain point, you're not risking anything. You're not doing anything. You're just sort of living in this teeny tiny little bubble. And that's how I found myself, of just, by the time, why risk it, why risk it, why risk it, why risk it? You're not flying, you're not driving, you're not doing this and this and that. So I think there's no reward culturally or medically or socially for pushing back against that and saying, I'm going to risk it because I want to live my life, or because I have a way that I want to raise my family. And I think that something that women can do, and this is not to put all the responsibility on women by any means, but that I have tried to do, is to say, you know what, I'm going to risk it. I'm going to do that. And one thing that I learned in therapy, actually, which was extremely helpful, that my therapist told me, was this refrain that sort of, this might be dangerous. And really, we're not talking about actually super dangerous things here, but things that I consider dangerous, like painting my daughter's nails, for example. But I'm going to do it because I want to live my life, right? Or things like taking a taxi in Mexico to the market, which I did all the time in my 20s, and is, probably involves some degree of risk. But my daughter is Mexican, and I want her to travel, and I want her to love traveling and love Mexico. And you know what? I'm going to do that because that's the way that I want to live my life. Now, obviously, that's not saying, woo, like, go totally crazy, or maybe it is, but pushing back against that paradigm of having to constantly sort of go back to that why risk it refrain, and sort of standing up for your values and your beliefs, and the way that you think you want to live your life and you want your family to live their lives.
All right, I think we probably only have time for one more question, although there are a lot of wonderful questions. Could you talk a little bit more about the toll of partner anxiety, and whether you believe that mothers end up taking on or absorbing the fears of their partners, but then are the only ones whose issues are tracked? If anxiety just ping-pongs back and forth between parents, but becomes the burden of the mother to fix, how do you think we need a movement to address fatherhood anxiety?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me there, I think what ends up happening, and part of why women have such intense anxiety, and I haven't done much research into fathers' anxiety, but I think mothers end up being the ones who are responsible and being seen as responsible. And this is something that I heard over and over again, right? That actually women's anxiety goes down if they aren't responsible. Like, and this is very much true in my case, where I could say, well, if this thing happens to my child, but my husband was watching her, then it's fine. Then you guys can go do this, which is really insane, which goes to show that, like, the blame has historically fallen on mothers. Like, to go back to the historical example of the maternal ISM and momism, part of the reason why there was so much anxiety about mothers was because men were coming back from World War II with all sorts of psychiatric problems. And that was blamed on mothers because, of course, mothers were, babying their sons, and their sons weren't even able to go, like, fight a proper war, right? So mothers have been blamed. That's true of autism. That's true of many things throughout history where mothers have taken the blame. And so I think, mothers absorb that very much in their bones in the experience of becoming a mother. And for fathers, there's just not the same dynamic at play. And I think there's been plenty of research that has shown, and that's not to say to minimize the anxiety of men in becoming fathers, but to say that there is a different gender dynamic. And because so many of the women will sort of take on this psychological burden of, like, everything from organizing their children's schedules to knowing, what are the milestones at this age and whatnot. There's just a different degree of anxiety there. And so I think really, if you're talking about changing that, I think we still have this notion that, like, a dad who does anything dad-like is like a great dad, and that's amazing. And I can see that with my own husband. My husband is a great dad, but even saying that, I'm sort of like, well, yeah, because he does stuff with my daughter, but he's a father, like, yeah. And I could see that especially when we were in Mexico. We lived there for a year when my daughter was little, and there was this sort of notion of, like, oh my God, he's an amazing dad. Like, he took her for 3 hours in the afternoon, and you're sort of like, I'm breastfeeding, like, 48 hours a day, it feels like. So I think we still have this standard. There was this New York Times article a few years ago that said, it said something like, when dads babysit their children. And there was this huge backlash from women saying dads aren't babysitters, they're parents. So I think that's a huge part of, like, changing that culture, where it's sort of like there is this co-parenting and both parents have the responsibility, and we need to be looking at sort of like the mental health of both parents. But also this notion that, like, a dad isn't necessarily like a heroic figure because he does anything at all, right? We've sort of moved past that stage, and we should be co-parenting in those circumstances.
So true. Oh, this has just been a wonderful presentation. But before we wrap up, we want to ask you one last question, which is, what are you reading right now?
Yeah, so I'm actually reading Anne Patchett for the first time. I guess one strange thing that's happened during this time is I've, like, been scouring my bookshelves for things because I quickly read everything that I already had checked out or that I had bought. And so I found Bel Canto, which is an Anne Patchett novel from 2002, which I'm loving. It's about a hostage situation. I love a good novel that has a really strong plot and is also really beautifully written and has a lot going on conceptually. So I've been really enjoying that. And it has managed to keep my quite fragmented attention right now. So that's good. So I would recommend that. Also, I always recommend The Overstory because it's such a beautiful book, and everyone I've recommended it to has just written me like, oh my goodness, like it will kind of ruin you for anything else for a while, but in a wonderful way. That's totally worth it. So I strongly recommend The Overstory. Another one that I recommend is How to Do Nothing. Very apropos for this time, Jenny Odell. It's a book that I just stumbled upon. I think it was, at least 4 or 5 months ago, and I will totally return to it now. It's a really beautiful book about just sort of like pushing back against what she calls the attention economy. So the way that, we're constantly on our phones, we're sort of constantly like obsessed with doing something. So I think that's another really beautiful one to read right now.
Yeah, and takes on a whole different meaning right now in these past couple months, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah, for coming. And thank you to the audience so much for coming and being part of this. Your patronage is what enables us to bring you programming like this. And we cannot continue to host the events without the book sales. So There's a green button on the bottom of your screen if you'd like to support Sarah and support Politics and Prose by buying Ordinary Insanity. That's the button to press. Also, you can do a search on our website for How to Do Nothing and Overstory and Bel Canto if you want to read those wonderful suggestions. If you would like to see a list of upcoming PNP Live events, you can click the PNP icon. And stay well read, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you. It's great.
Until next time, everyone.